Emma Chen stood behind the polished marble counter of the Grand Plaza Hotel, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her black vest for the third time that evening. At 23 years old, she had been working as a waitress at the hotel for nearly 2 years, saving every penny she could while pursuing her dream of becoming a concert pianist. The elegant ballroom beyond the service doors was already filling with guests dressed in designer gowns and tailored suits, their laughter and conversation creating a symphony of wealth and privilege that felt like a different world from her own. Tonight was special for reasons that had nothing to do with Emma's aspirations. Richard Blackwell, one of the city's most prominent real estate developers, was hosting his annual charity gala, an event that drew the elite from across the state. The man was known for two things: his extraordinary wealth, with a net worth that newspapers estimated in the hundreds of millions, and his reputation for being ruthlessly demanding. Emma had heard stories from other staff members about previous events he had hosted, tales of waiters being dressed down in front of guests for minor infractions, of impossible standards and public humiliations that left grown men and women in tears. Her manager, David, had gathered the entire waitstaff in the back hallway an hour before the doors opened. His usually relaxed demeanor had been replaced with visible tension as he went over the evening's protocols. Every glass had to be filled before it was half empty. Every plate had to be cleared within 30 seconds of the last bite. No one was to speak unless spoken to directly. No one was to make eye contact with Mr. Blackwell unless he initiated it. The list went on, each instruction adding another layer of pressure to an already stressful evening. Emma had been assigned to serve the main table, the one where Richard Blackwell himself would be seated along with the mayor, several city council members, and a collection of business leaders whose faces she recognized from the financial section of the newspaper. It was both an honor and a curse. The main table meant better tips, but it also meant being under the direct scrutiny of the man himself. She had tried to decline, suggesting that one of the more experienced servers would be better suited, but David had insisted. He said she had the steadiest hands and the most professional demeanor, qualities that would be essential for such high-profile guests. As the evening began, Emma moved through the ballroom with practiced grace, balancing trays of champagne flutes and carefully navigating between clusters of guests who barely noticed her presence. She had become expert at making herself invisible, a skill that all good servers developed over time. Watch everything, anticipate needs, but never intrude on the conversations or draw attention to yourself. It was a delicate dance, one that she had perfected through countless events just like this one. Richard Blackwell arrived fashionably late, making an entrance that commanded immediate attention. He was a tall man in his mid-50s, with silver hair swept back from a face that showed the confidence of someone who had never heard the word no without being able to override it with money or influence. His suit probably cost more than Emma made in 6 months. A younger woman clung to his arm, blonde and beautiful in a way that suggested considerable investment in maintaining that beauty. They moved through the crowd like royalty, accepting greetings and well wishes with the casual entitlement of those born into privilege. Emma filled water glasses at the main table as the guests took their seats, her movements smooth and efficient. She had just finished when Richard Blackwell sat down directly in front of her. He glanced up briefly, his eyes passing over her without real recognition, the way people often looked at service staff. She was furniture to him, a functional object meant to facilitate his comfort. She stepped back to her position along the wall, ready to respond to any need. The first course was served without incident. Emma moved between the kitchen and the dining room, delivering plates of seared scallops arranged artfully on beds of pureed cauliflower. The conversations at the main table were exactly what she had expected. Discussions of market trends, political maneuvering, vacation homes in the Hamptons, and upcoming mergers that would reshape the city's business landscape. She listened without meaning to, absorbing information that meant nothing to her own life but revealed everything about theirs. It was during the second course, a delicate filet mignon with truffle butter, that things began to go wrong. Emma had just placed a plate in front of a woman to Richard's left when another guest at the table gestured broadly while telling a story, his hand connecting with Emma's elbow. The plate tilted, and a small splash of the dark wine reduction sauce landed on the pristine white tablecloth, missing Richard's sleeve by mere inches. The conversation stopped. Every eye at the table turned toward Emma, and she felt her face flush hot with embarrassment. The sauce was already seeping into the expensive fabric, creating a dark stain that stood out like an accusation. She immediately began apologizing, reaching for her service cloth to try to blot the stain, but Richard held up his hand, stopping her. His voice carried across the suddenly quiet section of the ballroom, loud enough that nearby tables turned to see what was happening. He did not shout, which somehow made it worse. There was a cold amusement in his tone, the way someone might speak about an interesting but ultimately inconsequential mistake. He asked if the hotel made a habit of hiring people with such poor coordination, wondered aloud whether proper training was too expensive for their budget, suggested that perhaps they should stick to simpler tasks like bussing tables rather than actual service. Emma stood frozen, the cloth still in her hand, as laughter rippled through some of the guests. Others looked uncomfortable but said nothing, unwilling to challenge their host. She wanted to explain that it had not been her fault that the other guest had bumped her, but years of service industry experience had taught her that defending yourself only made things worse. The customer was always right, even when they were absolutely wrong. She apologized again, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest. Richard was not finished. He turned to the mayor, seated to his right, and made a comment about how difficult it was to find good help these days, how standards had fallen so dramatically. He suggested that perhaps Emma would be better suited to working at one of the diners downtown, places where precision and grace were not quite so important. Each word was chosen carefully to wound while maintaining a veneer of civilized discourse. He was destroying her professionally and personally while never raising his voice or using overtly cruel language. David appeared at her elbow within seconds, summoned by some invisible signal. He apologized profusely to Richard and the other guests, assured them that the situation would be handled, and guided Emma away from the table with a firm hand on her shoulder. She walked with her head high, refusing to let them see how much the moment had shaken her. Behind her, she could hear Richard launching into an anecdote about a similar incident at another event, turning her humiliation into dinner entertainment. In the service corridor, David's sympathy was genuine but brief. He could not afford to let the evening be disrupted further. He told Emma to take a few minutes to compose herself, then assigned her to work the dessert service for the side rooms, away from the main ballroom. It was a demotion, a visible sign that she had failed, even though both of them knew the incident had not truly been her fault. But fault did not matter in situations like this. What mattered was keeping the client happy, and Richard Blackwell was far too important a client to contradict. Emma found herself in one of the hotel's smaller function rooms, a space decorated with the same elegant touches but serving guests who had paid for access to the gala but not seats at the main tables. She went through the motions of serving chocolate torte and coffee, smiling automatically and responding to requests, but her mind was elsewhere. The humiliation still burned, not just because of what had happened, but because of how powerless she had been to defend herself. In Richard's world, people like her did not matter. They were interchangeable, disposable, worthy of mockery but not respect. What Richard Blackwell did not know, what none of them knew, was that Emma had not always been a waitress struggling to make ends meet. Before her parents had died in a car accident 3 years ago, she had been a scholarship student at the prestigious Eastman School of Music, studying under one of the country's most renowned piano instructors. She had performed at Carnegie Hall as part of a youth orchestra. She had won competitions that drew talented musicians from around the world. The piano had been her entire life, her passion, and her future. But scholarships did not cover living expenses, and when her parents died, the small amount of money they had left was consumed by funeral costs and settling their debts. Emma had been forced to withdraw from school, to set aside her dreams and focus on simple survival. She had moved to the city because it offered more job opportunities, had taken the position at the Grand Plaza because it paid better than most service jobs, and had been saving money with the desperate hope that one day she might be able to return to her studies. She had not touched a piano in over a year. The loss of it was like a constant ache, a phantom limb that she could still feel even though it was no longer part of her life. Sometimes she would pass by music stores and stop to look at the instruments in the windows, her fingers unconsciously moving through familiar patterns. But actually sitting down to play felt impossible. It reminded her of everything she had lost, everyone she had lost, and the future that had been taken from her. As Emma mechanically served desserts and cleared plates, she could hear music beginning in the main ballroom. Richard had hired a live orchestra for the evening, and they were playing pleasant but unremarkable background music, the kind of classical pieces that sounded sophisticated without demanding too much attention. She recognized the Vivaldi, the Mozart, the Chopin. Each note was a small knife reminding her of the life she used to have. The evening progressed with painful slowness, each minute stretching out as Emma continued her reduced duties in the side rooms. She could hear bursts of laughter from the main ballroom, the clinking of glasses during toasts, and the warm applause that followed speeches she could not quite make out. The orchestra played through their repertoire with professional competence, though Emma noticed small imperfections that most guests would never catch. A slightly rushed tempo in the Beethoven, a missed dynamic change in the Debussy. She tried to stop listening so critically, but years of intensive training had made it automatic. Around 9:30, David found her again. His expression was apologetic but firm. The event coordinator had requested that all available staff return to the main ballroom for the final portion of the evening. Richard Blackwell had apparently planned some sort of special entertainment, and they needed everyone on hand to manage the logistics. Emma wanted to refuse, to say that she had been humiliated enough for one night, but she needed this job. She needed every shift, every hour, every tip. So she nodded and followed David back toward the grand ballroom, steeling herself for whatever might come next. The room had been rearranged during the past hour. The dining tables had been cleared and pushed to the sides, creating an open space in the center. The orchestra had taken a break, their instruments resting on chairs near the small stage at the front of the room. A beautiful grand piano sat in the spotlight, its black surface gleaming under the chandeliers. Emma felt her heart constrict at the sight of it. She had not been this close to a quality instrument in so long. Richard Blackwell stood near the piano, champagne glass in hand, commanding the attention of his guests with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. He was explaining that he had arranged for a special performance, a surprise that he was certain everyone would enjoy. A renowned pianist from the city's symphony orchestra would be playing several pieces to cap off the evening's festivities. The guests applauded appreciatively, gathering in a semicircle around the performance area. Emma took her position along the wall with the other servers, trying to make herself invisible once again. She watched as an elegant woman in a flowing emerald gown made her way to the piano, acknowledging the applause with gracious nods. This was Catherine Brennan, a name Emma recognized immediately. She had seen Brennan perform twice during her time at Eastman, had studied recordings of her interpretations of Rachmaninoff and Liszt. The woman was genuinely talented, with a technique that combined power and delicacy in equal measure. Brennan settled onto the piano bench and began with a Chopin nocturne, her fingers moving across the keys with practiced ease. The room fell silent except for the music, and Emma found herself transported despite everything that had happened earlier. The piece was beautiful, executed with sensitivity and skill. For a few minutes she could forget where she was and why, could simply exist in the world the music created. The performance continued with several more pieces, each greeted with enthusiastic applause. Richard Blackwell looked supremely pleased with himself, as though he had personally created the music rather than simply hired someone to perform it. He made comments between pieces about his appreciation for the arts, about how important it was to support cultural institutions, about his own deep understanding of classical music. Emma noticed Catherine Brennan's slight smile at some of these comments, a professional mask covering what might have been amusement at his presumption. After about 30 minutes, Brennan finished her planned program with a vigorous Liszt etude that showcased her technical prowess. The applause was loud and genuine, and she stood to take several bows. Richard joined her near the piano, shaking her hand and making a show of presenting her with an envelope that presumably contained her payment. He then turned to address the crowd again, his voice carrying easily across the room. He announced that he had one more surprise for the evening. Since they had such a magnificent instrument and such an appreciative audience, he wanted to open the floor to anyone else who might wish to play. He said this with a knowing smile, clearly expecting that none of his wealthy guests would take him up on the offer. It was a rhetorical gesture, a way of seeming generous and spontaneous while knowing that nothing would actually come of it. Several people laughed and declined with self-deprecating comments about their lack of musical ability. One older gentleman joked that his piano lessons had ended badly when he was 8 years old and his teacher had quit in despair. The mood was light, jovial, exactly as Richard had intended. He was about to conclude the offer and move on to the next phase of the evening when a voice cut through the comfortable murmur of conversation. One of Richard's business associates, a man named Gregory Chen, whom Emma vaguely recognized from earlier in the evening, spoke up with an edge of mischief in his tone. He suggested that perhaps some of the staff might have hidden talents. After all, he said with barely concealed condescension, one never knew what skills people might possess. Several guests laughed at this, understanding the implicit mockery. The idea that a server or bartender might have the education or refinement to perform classical piano was absurd to them, a joke at the expense of people they considered their social inferiors. Richard seized on the idea with enthusiasm. His eyes scanned the servers lined up against the wall, and Emma felt her stomach drop as his gaze landed on her. He recognized her from the earlier incident, she could see it in the slight curl of his lip. Here was an opportunity to extend the evening's entertainment at her expense. He pointed directly at her and beckoned her forward, asking if she happened to play piano. Emma remained frozen in place, every instinct screaming at her to stay silent, to shake her head and let the moment pass. But something else was rising in her chest. something that had been building since the moment he had humiliated her over a sauce stain that had not even been her fault. It was not quite anger, though anger was part of it. It was more like a sudden, fierce need to reclaim something of herself, to remind herself that she was more than just a waitress who could be mocked and dismissed. Before she could fully process what she was doing, she heard herself say yes. The word came out clear and steady, and a ripple of surprise moved through the room. Richard's eyebrows rose, and she could see he had not actually expected an affirmative response. He recovered quickly, his expression shifting to something like anticipatory delight. This was even better than he had hoped. Now he could watch her fail publicly, could turn her presumption into another source of amusement for his guests. He gestured grandly toward the piano, inviting her to come forward. The other guests were watching with various expressions ranging from curiosity to barely hidden skepticism. Emma could feel David's eyes on her from across the room, probably wondering if she had lost her mind. She might well have. This could cost her her job, but her feet were already moving, carrying her across the polished floor toward the instrument that had once been the center of her entire world. As she approached the piano, Catherine Brennan caught her eye. The professional pianist's expression was neutral, but there was something in her gaze that might have been sympathy or perhaps recognition. She stepped aside gracefully, yielding the bench to Emma. Up close, the piano was even more beautiful than it had appeared from a distance. It was a Steinway concert grand, an instrument worth more than Emma would earn in a decade of waitressing. She sat down on the bench, and the familiarity of the position brought an unexpected rush of emotion. Her hands found their natural position above the keys, hovering there for a moment. The room was completely silent now, everyone waiting to see what would happen. She could feel Richard's smug anticipation, could sense the collective assumption that she was about to embarrass herself. They expected her to peck out a simple tune, perhaps chopsticks or a basic melody that any child might know. Emma closed her eyes briefly, letting herself remember who she had been before grief and circumstance had stripped away her identity. She thought of her piano teacher at Eastman, Professor Martinez, who had once told her that music was not about the notes on the page, but about the truth you brought to them. She thought of her mother, who had sat beside her through countless hours of practice, who had believed in her talent even when Emma herself had doubted. When she opened her eyes, she knew what she was going to play. Not something safe or simple, not something designed to merely prove competence. If she was going to do this, if she was going to expose this part of herself to these people who had spent the evening treating her as invisible and inferior, then she was going to play something that mattered. Something that would make them actually see her. She placed her fingers on the keys and began Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, one of the most technically demanding and emotionally powerful pieces in the classical repertoire. Of course, she would be playing it without the orchestra that normally accompanied it, but the piano part alone was substantial enough to stand on its own. The opening chords rolled out into the ballroom, rich and complex, and Emma felt something unlock inside her chest. The first notes of the Rachmaninoff seemed to physically alter the atmosphere in the grand ballroom. Emma's fingers moved across the keys with a confidence that came from muscle memory deeper than conscious thought. Each chord progression emerging with the kind of authority that could only come from years of serious training. The melody began to unfold, lyrical and achingly beautiful, and the skeptical expressions on the faces of Richard's guests began to shift into something else entirely. Emma had chosen this piece for reasons that went beyond its technical complexity. The second movement of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 had been the last piece she had performed publicly before her life had fallen apart. She had played it at a competition in Boston just weeks before her parents died, had earned a standing ovation, and the first-place trophy that still sat in a box in her tiny studio apartment. The music carried all of her grief, all of her lost dreams, and all of the defiant hope that maybe, somehow, those dreams were not entirely dead. Her hands knew every phrase, every dynamic shift, every moment where the music needed to breathe or surge forward. She had practiced this concerto hundreds of times, had worked through each difficult passage until her fingers could navigate them even in sleep. Now, after more than a year away from the piano, her body remembered what her mind had tried to forget. The technical challenges that would have defeated most amateur players flowed naturally from her touch. The romantic sweep of the melody filled the enormous room, and Emma became aware that something extraordinary was happening. People who had been standing in casual conversation groups were moving closer, drawn by the unexpected beauty emerging from the piano. The chatter and clinking of glasses had ceased entirely. Even the catering staff had stopped their work to listen, standing motionless with trays in their hands. Richard Blackwell's expression had transformed completely. The smug anticipation had vanished, replaced by shock that he was not quite able to conceal. He had expected to witness a humiliating failure, had probably been mentally composing the cutting remarks he would make afterward. Instead, he was hearing a performance that rivaled or exceeded what Catherine Brennan had delivered earlier. The professional pianist herself had moved to get a better view, her trained ear clearly recognizing the caliber of playing she was witnessing. As Emma moved into the more technically demanding sections of the piece, her fingers flying across the keys in rapid passages that required both precision and emotion, she felt herself truly returning to who she had once been. The waitress uniform, the stained tablecloth, the humiliation of being dismissed as clumsy and incompetent all faded into irrelevance. Here, in this music, she was not inferior to anyone in this room. Here, she was exactly who she had trained her entire life to be. The sweeping arpeggios cascaded from the piano like water, each note crystal clear despite the speed of execution. Emma's body moved with the music, leaning into the dramatic moments, pulling back for the tender passages. She had forgotten how complete she felt when playing, how the instrument became an extension of herself rather than a separate object. The piano responded to her touch with a richness of tone that made her heart ache. This was what a truly great instrument could do in the hands of someone who knew how to draw out its voice. She transitioned into a particularly challenging section, where the right hand carried a rapid melodic line, while the left provided a complex harmonic foundation. This was the kind of passage that revealed whether a pianist truly understood the architecture of the piece, or was simply hitting the correct notes. Emma shaped each phrase with careful attention to how it connected to what came before and what would follow, creating a narrative arc that gave the music emotional coherence. The mayor, who had been checking his phone earlier in the evening, had put it away entirely and was watching Emma with undisguised amazement. The city council members who had laughed at Richard's earlier mockery now looked uncomfortable, perhaps recognizing that they had participated in belittling someone whose abilities far exceeded their own in at least this domain. Gregory Chen, who had suggested that staff might have hidden talents as a joke, appeared stunned by how thoroughly his sarcasm had backfired. Emma could sense all of this happening around her, but it existed at a distance. Her primary awareness was focused on the music itself, on honoring Rachmaninoff's intentions while bringing her own interpretation to the performance. She thought about what this piece had meant to the composer, who had written it while struggling with depression and self-doubt. The music was about finding beauty and hope even in the midst of darkness, about the human capacity to create something transcendent despite suffering. As she approached the climax of the movement, building toward the soaring melodic statement that would serve as the emotional peak, Emma felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. She was crying for her parents who would never hear her play again. She was crying for the years of training that had seemed wasted. She was crying for every moment of the past year when she had felt invisible and insignificant. But she was also crying because the music was proving that none of it had been wasted, that the person she had been still existed somewhere inside the uniform and the exhaustion. The final section of the movement required both technical control and emotional abandon. The melody needed to sing out above complex harmonic support, needed to feel inevitable and surprising at the same time. Emma's years of study with Professor Martinez had prepared her for exactly this kind of interpretive challenge. She let the music swell, allowed herself to be fully present in each moment, and trusted her training to carry her through. When she played the final, gentle resolution, letting the last notes fade into silence with exquisite control, the ballroom remained completely quiet for several seconds. It was the kind of silence that follows only the most powerful performances, when an audience needs a moment to return from wherever the music has taken them. Emma lifted her hands from the keys and sat motionless, her shoulders rising and falling with deep breaths. Then the applause began. It started with Catherine Brennan, who was clapping with genuine enthusiasm and calling out her appreciation. Others joined quickly, and within seconds the entire room was applauding with an intensity that seemed to surprise even those doing it. People were not just being polite. They were responding to something that had genuinely moved them, that had exceeded every expectation they might have had. Emma stood up from the piano bench on slightly shaky legs, still processing what had just happened. She had exposed the most vulnerable part of herself to a room full of strangers, most of whom had considered her beneath their notice just minutes earlier. She turned to face the audience, and for the first time that evening, she allowed herself to make direct eye contact with them. She was not going to apologize or diminish what she had just done. Richard Blackwell was still standing where he had been when she started playing, but his entire demeanor had changed. The confident superiority was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like confusion. He began clapping somewhat mechanically, clearly trying to process how thoroughly the evening's narrative had shifted. The woman on his arm was applauding with what appeared to be genuine appreciation, leaning over to say something to him that Emma could not hear. Catherine Brennan approached Emma directly, extending her hand with a warm smile. She introduced herself, though Emma of course already knew who she was, and asked where Emma had studied. The question was asked with professional curiosity rather than condescension, one musician to another. Emma found herself explaining about Eastman, about her scholarship, about the abrupt end to her formal education. Brennan listened with focused attention, nodding in understanding. Other guests began to gather around, asking questions, offering compliments that sounded very different from the dismissive tones they had used earlier. Emma responded politely but briefly, still somewhat overwhelmed by the sudden shift in how she was being perceived. Just an hour ago, these same people had watched her be humiliated over a sauce stain and had done nothing. Now they wanted to talk to her about music theory and performance technique. David appeared at the edge of the crowd, his expression a mixture of pride and concern. Emma caught his eye and could read the unspoken question there. Was she okay? Did she need rescuing from this sudden attention? She gave him a small nod, trying to communicate that she was managing. He looked relieved but remained nearby, clearly ready to intervene if needed. The mayor approached Emma with what seemed like genuine interest, asking if she gave private lessons or performed regularly anywhere in the city. Emma explained her current situation as briefly as possible. Watching his expression shift from curiosity to something like embarrassment, as he realized that the talented musician he had just heard was working as a waitress out of economic necessity rather than choice. He recovered quickly, mentioning that the city had various arts programs and grants that might be of interest. Through all of this, Richard Blackwell remained at a distance, observing but not participating. Emma was acutely aware of his presence, of the way his earlier humiliation of her now hung in the air between them like something toxic. He had tried to make her feel small and incompetent, and instead she had revealed abilities that he could never possess regardless of his wealth. The power dynamic of the evening had not reversed exactly, but it had certainly been complicated. The crowd around Emma gradually began to disperse as guests returned to their conversations, and the social dynamics of the gala reasserted themselves. Catherine Brennan had given Emma her card, making her promise to get in touch so they could discuss potential opportunities. Several other people had expressed interest in hearing her play again, and one woman who identified herself as a board member of the city's Arts Foundation had asked for Emma's contact information. As the immediate attention faded, Emma found herself standing alone near the piano, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. The adrenaline that had carried her through the performance was draining away, leaving behind a strange mixture of elation and vulnerability. She had just revealed the most important part of herself to a room full of strangers, and now she was not entirely sure what happened next. David approached carefully, keeping his voice low so that only Emma could hear. He told her that she could take the rest of the evening off if she needed to, that the other staff could handle the remaining service. His tone was kind but also slightly uncertain, as though he was not quite sure how to relate to this version of Emma he had just discovered. She thanked him but declined. She needed the full shift hours, and more than that, she needed to finish the evening on her own terms rather than disappearing. She returned to her serving duties, moving among the guests with the same professional efficiency as before. But everything felt different now. People made eye contact when she approached their tables. They said thank you with a different tone, one that acknowledged her as a person rather than simply as staff. Some asked her additional questions about her training or complimented her performance again. The shift in treatment was both gratifying and unsettling. Richard Blackwell had retreated to a private corner of the ballroom with a small group of his closest business associates. Emma noticed him glancing in her direction several times, but he made no move to approach her or acknowledge what had happened. His body language suggested discomfort, though whether that discomfort came from embarrassment, anger, or something else entirely, Emma could not tell. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, Emma focused on the practical tasks of clearing tables and resetting the room for the next event. The other servers were treating her differently too, asking questions about her background and expressing amazement that she had been working alongside them all this time without mentioning her musical abilities. Emma found herself explaining repeatedly that it was not something she talked about, that the distance between who she had been and who she was now felt too painful to bridge in casual conversation. Around midnight, as Emma was stacking plates in the service corridor, Catherine Brennan found her again. The pianist had changed from her performance gown into more casual clothes and was clearly preparing to leave. She asked Emma if they could talk for a moment, and something in her expression suggested this was not just a polite follow-up to their earlier conversation. They moved to a quiet corner, and Brennan spoke directly. She said that she recognized something in Emma's playing, a level of technical training and musical maturity that did not develop accidentally. She had looked up Emma's name on her phone and found records of her competition wins and her acceptance to Eastman. She understood that life circumstances sometimes forced talented musicians away from their paths, and she wanted Emma to know that it did not have to be permanent. Brennan explained that she taught advanced students privately in addition to her performance career. She normally charged rates that Emma could never afford, but she occasionally took on scholarship students who showed exceptional promise. She would be willing to offer Emma lessons on a sliding scale basis, potentially even free of charge if Emma was willing to help her with some administrative tasks. It was not charity, Brennan insisted, but rather an investment in talent that deserved to be developed. Emma felt her throat tighten with emotion. This was the kind of opportunity she had stopped allowing herself to hope for. She managed to thank Brennan and agreed to contact her within the next few days to discuss details. After Brennan left, Emma stood alone in the corridor for a moment, trying to process everything that had happened in the past few hours. She had walked into the Grand Plaza Hotel that evening as an invisible waitress. She was leaving as something else entirely, though exactly what remained to be seen. The final hour of cleanup passed in a blur. Emma's mind was racing with possibilities, with the fragile hope that maybe her dream was not as dead as she had believed. At the same time, she tried to temper her optimism. One performance and one offer of help did not solve the fundamental challenges of her life. She still needed to pay rent, still needed to eat, still needed to navigate a world that did not make space for people without financial resources. As the staff gathered their belongings and prepared to leave, David pulled Emma aside one more time. He told her that he had received a message from the hotel's general manager, who had heard about her performance from several of the guests. The manager wanted to meet with Emma tomorrow to discuss something, though David did not have details. His expression suggested he thought it might be good news, but Emma had learned to be cautious about reading too much into vague promises. Emma walked out of the Grand Plaza Hotel into the cool night air, still wearing her server's uniform with her regular clothes in a bag over her shoulder. The city streets were mostly quiet at this hour, with only occasional taxis passing by and a few late-night pedestrians making their way home. She began the familiar walk to the bus stop, her mind replaying fragments of the evening. She thought about the moment when Richard Blackwell had called her forward, expecting to humiliate her further. She thought about the weight of the piano keys under her fingers, the way the instrument had responded to her touch after so long away. She thought about Catherine Brennan's offer and the mayor's suggestion about arts grants and the way perfect strangers had looked at her with respect after hearing her play. But she also thought about the fundamental unfairness that had been on display all evening. Richard and his wealthy friends lived in a world where talent and hard work were secondary to money and connections. They assumed that people in service positions were there because they lacked ability rather than opportunity. Her performance had challenged that assumption for a brief moment, but it had not changed the underlying structure of inequality that made such assumptions possible in the first place. As Emma waited for the bus that would take her back to her small apartment, she allowed herself to feel proud of what she had done. She had reclaimed something important, had reminded herself and everyone else that her worth was not determined by her current circumstances. At the same time, she recognized that one night of unexpected triumph did not resolve the larger questions about how she would build a sustainable life that included music. The bus arrived, mostly empty at this late hour. Emma found a seat near the back and rested her head against the window, watching the city pass by in streaks of light and shadow. Her fingers moved unconsciously on her lap, practicing passages from the Rachmaninoff, already thinking about what she might work on next if Brennan's offer actually materialized into regular lessons. When she finally reached her apartment building and climbed the 3 flights of stairs to her door, exhaustion hit her fully. She dropped her bag on the floor and collapsed onto her bed without bothering to change out of her uniform. Sleep came quickly, and with it dreams of music that felt both nostalgic and prophetic, reaching backward to who she had been and forward to who she might still become. Emma woke late the following morning to sunlight streaming through her apartment's single window and the sound of her phone buzzing insistently. She reached for it groggily, squinting at the screen to see several missed calls and text messages. Most were from coworkers at the hotel expressing amazement about the previous night's events. One was from David, reminding her about the meeting with the general manager and asking her to arrive by 2 o'clock that afternoon. As she prepared for the day, Emma found herself oscillating between hope and cynicism about what the meeting might entail. Hotel management might want to discuss creating some kind of musical entertainment position for her, which could provide more stable income while allowing her to perform. Or they might simply want to capitalize on the previous night's unexpected success by having her play occasionally at events, adding a novel touch without actually changing her employment status or compensation. She dressed carefully, choosing clothes that fell somewhere between her server's uniform and formal performance attire. A simple black dress that looked professional without being overly fancy, paired with the only nice shoes she owned. She pulled her dark hair back into a neat bun, the same style she had worn for countless recitals and competitions. Looking at herself in the mirror, she saw someone caught between identities, not quite a waitress anymore, but not yet whatever she might become next. The bus ride to the hotel felt different in daylight. Emma had made this journey hundreds of times before, but today she was traveling as someone who had been specifically requested rather than simply showing up for an assigned shift. The distinction felt meaningful even though she could not quite articulate why. She arrived 15 minutes early and waited in the employee break room, trying to calm her nerves. David found her there and walked with her to the administrative offices on the hotel's third floor, an area she had never had reason to visit before. He offered encouragement, but also a gentle warning not to expect too much too quickly. Management moved slowly, he reminded her, and even positive changes could take time to implement. Emma appreciated his attempt to manage her expectations, even as part of her resented the implication that she might be getting her hopes up unreasonably. The general manager, a polished woman in her 50s named Margaret Harrison, greeted Emma warmly and invited her into a tastefully appointed office. She began by congratulating Emma on the previous night's performance, explaining that she had received enthusiastic feedback from multiple guests, including Richard Blackwell himself. Emma felt a flash of surprise at that last detail, but kept her expression neutral. Margaret explained that the hotel was always looking for ways to enhance their guest experience and differentiate themselves from competitors. The idea of having live classical piano music in their lobby lounge several evenings per week had been discussed before, but they had struggled to find the right performer. Most professional musicians commanded fees that made regular performances economically unfeasible, while less skilled players did not create the ambience they were hoping for. Emma listened carefully as Margaret outlined a potential arrangement. The hotel would like to hire her to perform piano in the lobby lounge 3 evenings per week, Tuesday through Thursday, for 2 hours each evening. The compensation would be significantly more per hour than she earned serving tables, though still modest by professional musician standards. She would retain her current serving position for the other shifts, maintaining her income stability while building performance experience. There was a catch, of course. The arrangement would begin as a 3-month trial period. If guest feedback remained positive and the music demonstrably enhanced the hotel's atmosphere, they would discuss making it permanent and potentially increasing the number of performance hours. If it did not work out, Emma would return to serving full-time. Margaret presented this as reasonable business practice, and Emma supposed it was, even as she recognized the precariousness of the offer. Emma asked several practical questions about repertoire expectations, break times, and whether she would have input on the specific piano that would be placed in the lobby. Margaret seemed impressed by the professionalism of the questions and assured her that they would acquire a quality instrument for the position. She also mentioned that tips would be allowed, with a discreet jar placed on the piano, which could potentially supplement the base compensation significantly. After some negotiation about scheduling and start dates, Emma accepted the offer. They shook hands, and Margaret asked her to stop by Human Resources to complete the necessary paperwork for the modified position. As Emma left the office with David, she felt a cautious optimism beginning to take root. This was not everything she had once hoped for from her musical career, but it was something. It was a step back toward the life she had thought was lost forever. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Emma contacted Catherine Brennan, and they scheduled her first lesson for the following week. Brennan lived in an elegant brownstone with a beautiful Bersendorfer grand piano in what had been converted into a dedicated music room. Their first session together confirmed what Brennan had suspected after hearing Emma play. Beneath the rust of disuse and grief, there was still an exceptional musician who simply needed guidance and support to re-emerge. Emma also followed up on the mayor's suggestion about arts grants, researching programs that provided support for emerging musicians. Most had application deadlines months away, but she began preparing materials, gathering recordings of her old performances, and drafting the personal statements that seemed to be required for every application. The process was time-consuming and often frustrating, but it gave her something to work toward beyond simple survival. Her first performance in the hotel lobby took place on a Tuesday evening in early summer. The hotel had acquired a beautiful Yamaha baby grand piano, positioned near the main windows where passers-by on the street could see into the elegant space. Emma had spent hours preparing her setlist, choosing pieces that would create a sophisticated atmosphere without being too demanding of audience attention. Guests in a hotel lobby wanted pleasant background music, not performances that required concentrated listening. She played a mixture of classical standards and jazz-influenced pieces, watching people come and go while her hands moved across the keys. Some guests paused to listen for a few moments before continuing on their way. Others settled into the comfortable chairs nearby with drinks from the bar, staying for multiple pieces. The tip jar accumulated a modest but encouraging collection of bills throughout the evening. What surprised Emma most was how natural it felt to be playing regularly again. Her technique, which had felt uncertain during that first performance at Richard's gala, began to solidify with consistent practice and performance. The muscle memory that had seemed lost was merely dormant, awakening more fully with each passing day. Her sessions with Catherine Brennan accelerated this recovery, addressing technical issues Emma had not even realized had developed. As weeks passed, Emma's performances became a recognized feature of the Grand Plaza's atmosphere. Regular guests began to request favorite pieces. Travelers stopping at the hotel mentioned the live music in their online reviews. Margaret Harrison looked increasingly satisfied with the arrangement, and there were hints that the trial period might be shortened or the permanent position offered earlier than originally discussed. Emma also began to receive inquiries about performing at private events, recommendations from guests who had heard her play at the hotel. These opportunities paid significantly better than her regular hotel performances and allowed her to build a small but growing reputation as a skilled pianist available for hire. She was careful to accept only engagements that did not conflict with her hotel schedule, but the additional income made a real difference in her financial stability. 3 months after that transformative night at Richard Blackwell's gala, Emma's life had shifted in ways both profound and subtle. She had officially transitioned to a permanent position as the hotel's resident pianist, performing 4 evenings per week with her serving shifts reduced to weekend brunches. The financial improvement was modest but meaningful. For the first time since her parents died, she was not constantly calculating whether she could afford basic necessities. Her lessons with Catherine Brennan had evolved from simple technical restoration into genuine artistic development. Brennan pushed Emma to think more deeply about interpretation, to develop her own voice rather than simply reproducing what she had been taught at Eastman. They worked through challenging repertoire together, and Brennan occasionally invited Emma to play at informal gatherings of musicians and arts patrons at her home, slowly building Emma's network within the city's classical music community. One evening in late September, Emma arrived at the hotel for her usual Tuesday performance to find an elegantly dressed older couple waiting near the piano. David intercepted her before she could reach them, explaining quietly that they had specifically requested to speak with her. They were James and Victoria Sterling, prominent philanthropists who funded various arts organizations throughout the city. They had heard Emma play several weeks earlier and had returned specifically to talk with her. The Sterlings explained that they were in the process of establishing a new scholarship program for talented musicians who had experienced significant life disruptions. The program would provide financial support, mentorship, and performance opportunities to help these musicians rebuild their careers. They had been moved by Emma's story, which they had learned about through conversations with other guests at the hotel, and they wondered if she might be interested in being one of the program's first recipients. Emma listened with careful attention as they outlined what the scholarship would entail. Full tuition coverage if she chose to return to formal education, or alternatively, funding for private lessons and living expenses if she preferred to continue her current path while developing her performance career. Access to practice spaces with quality instruments. Introductions to concert organizers, recording opportunities, and other professional connections that could open doors currently closed to her. She asked the questions that experience had taught her to ask. What were the obligations associated with accepting such support? How long would the funding last? What happened if she did not meet whatever standards or expectations came with the scholarship? The Sterlings answered each question directly and thoughtfully. The program was designed to provide genuine support rather than creating new dependencies or obligations. Recipients would be expected to perform at occasional fundraising events for the foundation. But beyond that, the goal was simply to help talented musicians achieve their potential. Emma requested time to consider the offer, and the Sterlings readily agreed, providing her with detailed written information about the program and their contact information. After they left, she sat at the piano in a daze, trying to process what had just happened. This was the kind of opportunity that could genuinely transform her situation, that could bridge the gap between her current reality and the future she had thought was forever out of reach. That evening's performance was colored by distraction as Emma's mind circled around the implications of the Sterlings' offer. Part of her wanted to accept immediately, to grab onto this lifeline with both hands. Another part worried about dependence on philanthropic generosity that could be withdrawn as easily as it had been offered. She had learned the hard way how quickly circumstances could change, how fragile security could be. After her performance ended, Emma walked to Catherine Brennan's brownstone, where she had been invited for tea. Over the past months, their relationship had evolved beyond teacher and student into something approaching genuine friendship. Brennan was one of the few people Emma felt comfortable discussing the deeper complexities of her situation with, someone who understood both the musical and practical dimensions of the choices she faced. Brennan listened to Emma's account of the Sterling's offer and asked thoughtful questions about Emma's hesitations. She pointed out gently that accepting help was not the same as becoming dependent, that recognizing an opportunity was not the same as being naive about potential risks. The Sterlings had a solid reputation in the arts community, and their scholarship program, while new, appeared to be genuinely well-intentioned. Sometimes, Brennan suggested, the bravest choice was allowing yourself to hope. Their conversation shifted to larger questions about what Emma ultimately wanted from her musical life. Did she want to pursue a performance career, working towards solo recitals and concerto appearances? Did she see herself primarily as a collaborative pianist, accompanying other musicians? Was teaching something that interested her? Emma found herself admitting that she was no longer certain. The dreams she had held at 19 felt both precious and somehow inadequate to capture who she had become at 23. Brennan shared her own story of navigating the classical music world, the compromises and adaptations required to build a sustainable career. She spoke about the reality that very few musicians achieved the kind of international solo career that music students often imagined. Most successful musicians cobbled together income from various sources such as performing, teaching, recording, and whatever other opportunities presented themselves. The key was finding combinations that provided both financial stability and artistic satisfaction. Emma left Brennan's house late that evening with a clearer sense of perspective. The Sterling Scholarship was not a magical solution that would resolve all challenges, but it was a genuine opportunity that could provide breathing room to develop her abilities and explore possibilities. After several more days of consideration and consultation with the few people whose advice she trusted, Emma contacted the Sterlings and accepted their offer. The next 6 months brought changes that would have seemed impossible during those dark days immediately after her parents' death. Emma enrolled in a conservatory program for adult students, taking classes in music theory, history, and performance practice while maintaining her hotel performances and continuing lessons with Brennan. The Sterling Scholarship covered tuition and provided a modest living stipend that, combined with her hotel income, finally lifted her above the constant edge of financial precarity. She began performing at more prestigious venues, starting with smaller recital halls but gradually working toward larger spaces and more significant programs. Her technique continued to develop, and more importantly, she was developing artistic maturity, finding her own interpretive voice rather than simply reproducing what she had been taught. Critics who reviewed her performances noted a depth of emotional communication that set her apart from more technically proficient but less expressive pianists. Through the Sterling's network, Emma was introduced to other musicians, arts administrators, and people who could help advance her career. She learned to navigate the social dimensions of the classical music world, understanding that success required not just talent, but also relationship building, professional presentation, and strategic decision-making about which opportunities to pursue. Almost a year after Richard Blackwell's gala, Emma received an unexpected invitation. The city's symphony orchestra was hosting a fundraising event, and they wanted her to be the featured soloist performing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 with full orchestral accompaniment. It would be her most significant performance since returning to professional music, the kind of opportunity that could significantly raise her profile if executed well. Emma accepted immediately, then spent the next 2 months preparing intensively. Working with a full orchestra was different from solo performance in ways both technical and artistic. She needed to coordinate with the conductor, balance her sound against the orchestral forces, and maintain both individual expression and ensemble unity. Catherine Brennan connected her with a coach who specialized in concerto preparation, and they worked through every phrase, every transition, every moment where soloist and orchestra needed to breathe together. As the performance date approached, Emma found herself thinking often about that night at the Grand Plaza when she had played this same piece alone at the piano. That performance had been an act of reclamation, a refusal to accept the diminishment Richard Blackwell had tried to impose. This upcoming performance felt different, less about proving something to others and more about honoring the music itself and the journey that had brought her back to it. The evening of the symphony performance, Emma arrived early for the final rehearsal. The concert hall was magnificent, with acoustics designed specifically for orchestral performance. She had played there once before, years ago as part of a youth orchestra, but being the featured soloist was entirely different. Walking onto the stage during rehearsal, she felt a mixture of nervousness and belonging. The rehearsal went well. The conductor was supportive and collaborative, making adjustments to balance and tempo that helped integrate Emma's interpretation with the orchestra's sound. The musicians were professional and encouraging, several of them complimenting her playing during breaks. By the time they finished, Emma felt confident about the evening performance even as she remained appropriately nervous about the high stakes. Back in the dressing room, Emma prepared mentally for the concert. She went through her usual pre-performance routine, warming up her fingers, reviewing challenging passages in her mind, breathing deeply to manage adrenaline. David had driven in from the suburbs to attend, as had several of her regular guests from the hotel. Catherine Brennan would be there, as would the Sterlings and various other people who had become part of Emma's redeveloped musical life. What Emma did not know was that Richard Blackwell had also purchased tickets for the performance. He had seen the announcement in the symphony's promotional materials and recognized Emma's name immediately. In the year since his gala, he had thought about that evening more often than he cared to admit. The memory of his attempted humiliation and Emma's unexpected response had lingered uncomfortably, raising questions about his own behavior that he preferred not to examine too closely. Richard arrived at the concert hall with a different companion than the woman who had attended his gala, settling into his seat in the orchestra section with mixed feelings about what he was about to witness. Part of him hoped Emma would struggle, would fail to meet the demands of performing with a full orchestra, thus validating his original dismissive assessment. Another part, smaller and less acknowledged, hoped she would succeed spectacularly, though he could not have articulated why her success mattered to him. The concert began with an orchestral piece, a Brahms symphony that showcased the ensemble's considerable abilities. Emma waited backstage, listening to the performance through monitors, using the time to maintain her focus and readiness. When the Brahms concluded and intermission passed, it was finally time for the Rachmaninoff. The stage manager gave her the signal, and Emma walked out to join the conductor and orchestra. The applause that greeted her entrance was warm and encouraging. Emma took her place at the piano, adjusting the bench height slightly and arranging her dress so it would not interfere with the pedals. She made eye contact with the conductor, who smiled reassuringly. The concertmaster nodded to her with professional respect. Then the conductor raised his baton, and the orchestra began the concerto's opening chords. The piano entrance, when it came, felt like stepping off a cliff and discovering you could fly. Emma's fingers found the keys and the familiar phrases emerged, but now supported and enhanced by the orchestra's rich harmonic textures. The interplay between soloist and ensemble created something neither could achieve alone, a collaborative beauty that justified all the hours of preparation. Emma moved through the first movement with growing confidence, navigating the technical challenges while remaining attentive to the conductor's interpretive choices and the orchestra's responses. The audience faded from her consciousness. She existed entirely in the music, in the dialogue between piano and orchestra, in the unfolding of Rachmaninoff's profoundly moving composition. The second movement, the same section she had played alone at Richard's gala, took on new dimensions with orchestral support. The string section's lush accompaniment enhanced the melody's romantic sweep, while the other instrumental voices added colors and textures that deepened the emotional impact. Emma felt tears forming again as she played, not from grief this time, but from the profound satisfaction of finally performing this piece as it was meant to be heard. In the audience, Richard Blackwell found himself genuinely moved by the performance. He had attended countless concerts over the years, usually as much for social positioning as for actual appreciation of the music. But something about watching Emma command the stage with such authority and artistry penetrated his usual detachment. This was the same woman he had mocked for spilling sauce, the same person he had dismissed as clumsy and incompetent. The cognitive dissonance was profound and uncomfortable. The final movement of the concerto built toward its triumphant conclusion with mounting energy and technical display. Emma and the orchestra locked together in perfect synchronization, driving toward the final, decisive chords. When those last notes rang out and silence fell over the concert hall, there was a moment of collective breath-holding before the applause erupted. The audience rose to their feet almost immediately, the ovation building in intensity. Emma stood and bowed, then gestured to the orchestra to acknowledge their contribution. The conductor shook her hand warmly and said something she could not quite hear over the continuing applause. She bowed again, then walked off stage, her heart pounding with a mixture of relief and elation. But the applause continued, and the stage manager indicated she should return for additional bows. Emma walked back out, the sound washing over her, and allowed herself to fully feel the moment. This was what she had worked for throughout her childhood and adolescence. This was what grief and circumstance had stolen from her. And this was what she had somehow impossibly found her way back to. After multiple curtain calls, Emma finally left the stage for the last time that evening. In the green room, she was immediately surrounded by well-wishers. Catherine Brennan embraced her with genuine pride, declaring that she had surpassed even the high expectations Brennan had held. The Sterlings offered warm congratulations and mentioned that they had already received inquiries from other concert organizers who had been in attendance. David presented her with flowers and admitted to having gotten emotional during the second movement. The symphony's development director approached Emma to discuss future performance opportunities, mentioning that several board members had been impressed and wanted to feature her in upcoming seasons. A recording producer introduced himself and asked if she would be interested in discussing a possible project. The evening was rapidly transforming from a singular achievement into a launching point for additional opportunities. As the crowd in the green room began to thin and Emma was preparing to leave, a staff member informed her that someone had sent a message requesting a brief conversation if she was willing. The person's name was Richard Blackwell. Emma felt her stomach tighten, the triumph of the evening suddenly complicated by the memory of their previous encounter. She considered declining, but ultimately decided to face whatever he wanted to say. The staff member led her to a quiet corner of the lobby where Richard waited, looking uncomfortable in a way she had never seen during their previous interactions. He thanked her for agreeing to speak with him, and there was a humility in his tone that seemed unfamiliar. Richard began by acknowledging how he had treated her at his gala, admitting that his behavior had been inexcusable regardless of the circumstances. He said that watching her perform that evening had forced him to confront some uncomfortable truths about his own assumptions and prejudices. He had spent his life believing that success and worth were primarily functions of wealth and social position, and Emma's trajectory over the past year had challenged that belief in ways he was still processing. He did not try to make excuses or explain away his actions. He simply apologized directly and without qualification and said that he hoped her career would continue to flourish. He mentioned that he planned to make a substantial donation to the Sterling Scholarship Program that had supported her, not as a way of seeking forgiveness, but as an acknowledgement that genuine talent deserved support regardless of a person's economic circumstances. Emma listened carefully, trying to gauge his sincerity. The apology could not undo the humiliation she had experienced or the casual cruelty he had displayed. But she also recognized that people were capable of growth and change, that rigid unforgiveness sometimes said more about the person withholding forgiveness than the person seeking it. After a moment of consideration, she thanked him for the apology and acknowledged the donation he planned to make. Their conversation concluded shortly after, neither attempting to extend it into false friendship or deeper reconciliation. Richard returned to his companion and Emma rejoined her supporters. The interaction had been brief but significant, a closing of a chapter that had begun with humiliation and ended with something approaching mutual understanding. In the weeks following the symphony performance, Emma's career accelerated in ways that would have seemed impossible during her years of serving tables at the Grand Plaza. She received invitations to perform at festivals, to record for independent labels, and to teach master classes for advanced students. The trajectory was not straight toward international stardom, but rather toward a sustainable career built on multiple income streams and genuine artistic development. Emma continued performing at the hotel on a reduced schedule, not because she needed the income as desperately as before, but because she had developed genuine affection for the space and the regular guests who had supported her during her rebuilding phase. She also maintained her lessons with Catherine Brennan, their relationship having evolved into a collegial partnership where they consulted each other about interpretive choices and career decisions. The Sterling Scholarship Program expanded, supporting additional musicians with stories similar to Emma's. She became involved in helping identify potential recipients and mentoring some of the younger scholars, finding satisfaction in being able to offer others the kind of support she had received. She spoke at fundraising events about her own experience, helping donors understand the real impact their contributions could have on talented individuals facing systemic barriers. 2 years after that transformative night at Richard Blackwell's gala, Emma performed Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 again, this time with a major orchestra in a performance that was broadcast nationally. Critics praised both her technical mastery and her profound emotional communication. The recording that resulted from that performance became her debut album, which received enthusiastic reviews and modest commercial success. Emma also returned to Eastman to complete her degree, taking advantage of the Sterling Scholarship and her now more flexible schedule. Walking through the familiar campus buildings, she felt both the weight of what she had lost during her time away and the satisfaction of having found her way back. Professor Martinez, her former teacher, welcomed her return with tears in his eyes, telling her that he had never doubted she would eventually resume her musical path. Life was not perfect. Emma still faced challenges related to financial sustainability, the competitive nature of the classical music world, and the ongoing work of processing grief and trauma from her parents' death and the difficult years that followed. But she had proven to herself that resilience was real, that lost dreams could sometimes be reclaimed, and that worth did not depend on how others chose to perceive or treat you. She thought sometimes about that moment at Richard's gala when she had made the split-second decision to walk to the piano rather than remaining silent. That single choice had set in motion a chain of events that transformed her life, but the transformation had not been magical or instantaneous. It had required consistent effort, acceptance of help from others, willingness to be vulnerable, and patient persistence through setbacks and uncertainties. Emma's story circulated in the classical music community, becoming a reminder that talent could emerge from unexpected places and that assumptions about worth based on occupation or circumstance were often deeply wrong. Young musicians facing their own challenges reached out to her, asking for advice or simply sharing their own struggles. She tried to be honest with them about both the possibilities and the difficulties, encouraging hope without promising easy solutions. On the 5th anniversary of her parents' death, Emma performed a solo recital dedicated to their memory. She played pieces they had loved, including some that she had performed for them during her years of study. The concert was emotionally difficult but also healing, a way of honoring both the grief of their loss and the gratitude for their support during her formative years. In the audience sat many of the people who had helped her rebuild her life, creating a community of support that would have made her parents proud. Emma continued to grow as a musician and as a person, understanding that the journey of artistic development and personal growth never truly concluded. There would always be new technical challenges to master, new interpretive insights to discover, new ways of understanding both music and life. The humiliation at Richard's gala had become a turning point rather than a defining moment, important but not determinative of everything that followed. She sometimes returned to the Grand Plaza Hotel, not as an employee but as a guest or a visitor. She would stop by to chat with David and other former coworkers, and occasionally she would sit at the piano in the lobby and play a few pieces for old time's sake. The instrument held no bitterness for her, only the memory of perseverance and the knowledge that returning to what you love is always possible, even when the path appears impossibly blocked.